Hello, I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome to Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Today, we're talking about grief. Sometimes it feels like we live in a world surrounded by sadness that demands a capacity for grieving and the power of compassion. Chaplain Dan Koch from Lutheran Church of Hope will help us understand the process of grieving and how it affects those around us. Let's meet Chaplain Dan Koch and learn more about what we're going to talk about today. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me on board today. You touched on a couple of things there, talking about how grief seems to follow us around in many different aspects of our life. For most people, when they think about grief, they think about grief as after having somebody's died. But we also experience grief when we have other kinds of losses too. Loss of jobs, divorces, loss of personal autonomy, things that we have taken for granted for many, many years. When they're gone, all of a sudden we're left kind of bereft as far as figuring out what to do next. We just experienced a pandemic, and things are not going to be the same as they were. They're going to go back to a type of normal that have been that's been impacted by what the COVID pandemic has brought, but we're never going to go back to the way it was before. And I think that's kind of the thing that we have to remember about grief, is that when we experience a loss, a lot of times it's not going to go back to where it was. It's going to be something new, the new normal, as we say. But there's a lot that goes into grieving. When we think about how people experience the initial impact of a loss, a lot of it is contextual. A lot of it has to do with what were we expecting it? Was it something that we could anticipate? Is it something that we weren't expecting? What's our culture? What's our experience as far as our background is concerned? And we can talk about spirituality too. Who it is that we believe is most important, or whatever is most important, and how our relationship is with that. So that's a pretty complex term when we talk about grief.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, grief is associated with loss, maybe change. And I know that, if you lose your favorite pen or favorite pocket knife, it might, for days, you might be turning over every corner of the house that you might imagine you might have lost it or dropped it. And it takes days to get over a very small item. And when we talk about personal loss of loved ones, people say it takes years. And I don't know that humans are built, well, maybe humans that I know aren't built to have the patience to think in terms of years of self-care and healing to get over something like that. And yet, in a way, it honors the passing of what we've lost. And so there's a good side to it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we have to kind of go back to early childhood development. When we think about kids that do well, they have a caregiver, they have some parents in their lives that are always attentive, always there for them, and they form that attachment, that bond. We know that kids that don't attach to a primary caregiver, they can develop what's called failure to thrive. We see this a lot during war times, where both parents have been killed and kids are housed in orphanages and things like that, and their physical needs are taken care of, but it's that closeness, it's that comfort that they get from those caretakers. So when we think about losing a primary relationship like that, when we think about that in that terms, we really are hardwired for relationship. And so when those relationships are diminished or are gone, not within our grasp anymore, we are going to very much feel that. We're going to feel very unsteady for quite some time, until we have built up that structure around us that can not take its place, but at least support us in a way that we can continue to move forward.
You talked about spirituality, and that can take many forms. I mean, what's sort of the range? I mean, may not necessarily be a religious spirituality. It might be a family-oriented one or a compassionately oriented one. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, spirituality is really about the quality of relationship to whatever or whomever is most important to us. So if we have a close-knit family and we lose somebody within that family, we're going to feel that significantly. But if we're kind of fragmented, we don't really have a great, deal of relationship with that person who's maybe passed away, we may not feel that impact. So spirituality can really be about how we've integrated ourselves into other people's lives and other ways that we kind of express a need or a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a sense of being a part of something bigger than ourselves. Lots of research being done on blue zones around the world, and spirituality from around the world in many different parts. So it doesn't necessarily mean religious. When we talk about spirituality, it has to do with the quality of those relationships. And we see in many places around the world that the more people are connected and the more intergenerational those connections are, people seem to live longer, seem to have happier lives, seem to feel more stable when there are losses or tragedies that happen. So I think we're working on figuring out how that all works together.
That's a great point. Well, we take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about grief. See you all after the break. You don't want to miss this.
The black truck? Hey, Christina from accounting.
Yeah, hi.
Hey, I used to date a girl named Christina.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then she dumped me for my best friend. You want to see some photos of them that I took?
I don't.
I thought we talked about this, buddy.
Buzzed and overshared again?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna call a car.
That's a smart idea.
So yeah, I know, that's why I did it.
Hey, you're gonna get back to the top of the mountain.
Does that mean I'm gonna get back with Christina?
No.
Oh.
No.
Every second, 127 new devices connect to the internet. You can feel it happening. Our digital world expanding with every breath. We're entering a whole new era of connectivity, and MediaCom will be ready to power it with one of the nation's first 10G platforms. We'll be bringing you more speed, more capacity, more security, and the power to do more than you ever dreamed possible.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're here with Chaplain Dan Koch from the Lutheran Church of Hope, and we're talking about grief because we're all going to experience it, and most of us with little preparation. And we sort of live in a world that proclaims its tragedies, but we need help coping. Give us a little better understanding of this whole spectrum of grief and the grieving process.
Sure. So when we think about grief, we have to kind of think about it as being a constellation of thoughts and feelings. It's not just one thing. It's not just one expression. It's an internal process, but we also have to talk about mourning. Mourning is then taking that grief that's on the inside and then expressing it in a meaningful way to the outside. We also have to think too that, we hear sometimes about grief work, and originally it was coined by Sigmund Freud, but what we have learned a little bit more about that is that it is really a spiritual process. Our grief and mourning are normal. They're our normal reaction to a real tragedy, a real loss. So grief is really a natural process of reconciling that loss to reality. And it takes work and it takes time, but there's no preconceived time frame. There's really not any right way or wrong way to grieve. It's simply a matter of finding your own pace and finding a way to express some of those things. We have to think about too, if we watch somebody suffer a long progressive illness that it ultimately results in death, the grief that person who is dying expresses and experiences is different than the family member who has to be there with them. So we have to kind of think about grief is not just a singular process, but there's multiple people that are involved in that as well.
Can you share a little insight on the difference between grief and mourning?
Sure.
As someone that's just recently lost his parent, my dad, I thought I've contextualized everything in grief, and then you use the word mourning, and I go, gosh, I don't know if I've mourned. I got to know more about this.
Right. So you think about grief is a complicated process whereby you're trying to come to terms with it, but mourning is the actual expression of that loss. So it's really about a process of action is what mourning is. When we think about Culturally, in the past, there are, and in some cultures today, there are actually funerals that are held, and people hire mourners. People come in and cry and wail and express that grief in a very vocal way, in a very outgoing way. And in some funeral services, you'll see that. In others, it'll be much more subdued. But whatever that mourning process is, it's really about getting what is on the inside and letting other people know what it is that you're experiencing. It's very much a very individual and cultural kind of expression.
Is there a finishing line or an end to grief?
Well, I guess that's kind of a running definition of what it is. What does it mean to heal? So when we think about having surgery and you're cut open and you're, whatever organ is operated on, and then they sew you back up, there's going to be physical evidence. There's going to be some scarring. The healing may take place inside, and it takes time to do those kinds of things. But really, we have to think about grief as being something that has left a scar. It's not going to be the way that it was. It can be returned to health. It can be returned to a better state. But in terms of, it does have an effect. There will be some residual expressions of that as we go forward. And some of that can be really positive. Some of that can be really, really spur people to take action in a positive direction, change the way that they've been living, change the things that they've been doing into a much more positive outlook. Or it can do the opposite. It can really put us into a tailspin. So it really has to do with where that person's at.
I have a question. We've dealt a lot on the show with parents that have lost loved ones to either drug overdoses or suicide. And in many instances, they talk about a period when their children are alive or their loved ones are alive, but in a way they're grieving them because they're losing control. They can't help them. They're disassociating from the family, and the love is not connected in a way that the ones that care about them would like.
Yep.
And then they get the double whammy when something bad happens, where you weave in not only that grieving sort of amped up, but the guilt
Right.
that goes along with it. Is it common for everybody to believe they somehow could have done something differently? And is that part of the process?
It actually is. It's very much related to the fact that we don't want to lose that person. We don't want to lose that relationship. We want to see that person doing well. We try as we can to care give and be there for that person. But ultimately, death is stronger. Death is reality in this world. And we can't do everything for that person. And so we end up second guessing ourselves, saying, did I do the right thing? Should I have been there more? Should I have done there? And so we end up thinking about ways in which we may have done differently. Unfortunately, we can kind of beat ourselves up with that. We have to kind of come to the place where we understand there really probably isn't anything that we could have done differently, because we were doing the best we could at the time. And so we really have to give ourselves a lot of grace and a lot of space when we think about those things.
No, those are great points. So we'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll ask Chaplain Dan Koch to talk about how he sees people and the world changing in the face of all the events that affect our lives, how people are doing differently today than they might have 15, 20, or 30 years ago. See you all after the break.
Multiple studies have shown that marijuana can slow both driver reaction and response time, which can be really dangerous. He's here. He's here.
Wait. What?
I can't drive.
Why? My. Oh.
Every second, 127 new devices connect to the internet. You can feel it happening, our digital world expanding with every breath. We're entering a whole new era of connectivity, and MediaCom will be ready to power it with one of the nation's first 10G platforms. We'll be bringing you more speed, more capacity, more security, and the power to do more than you ever dreamed possible.
Hello, I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're talking with Chaplain Dan Koch about grief. Dan, you've been a great storyteller. Keep it up.
Hey, thanks, Peter. Hey, one of the things that you mentioned before we went to break, you mentioned how things may have changed over the last few years, several years. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have the internet like we have today. We didn't have a lot of the connections that we have, the ways to connect digitally that we have today. But yet in America, we seem to be a lot less connected. We're a lot more disconnected from the people close to us. We've moved around a lot. So there's been a change in how that has affected ways people experience grief and what it is that they can do. So we have to kind of think about too, where are we going? What is it that we're trying to express? What is it that we have to try and figure out as we're going through that process? It isn't just one way that we experience grief. It's really how we can find community within our grieving. One of the worst things that I see happening all the time around churches, especially at this church, is that when there is a death, when someone does die, if there's not a close family, how much those people struggle. How many times that I see people come into our grief share classes, coming in for one-to-one talks with pastors and things like that, where they are just feeling completely cut off and isolated. And sometimes that is the worst part of grief, is feeling like we don't have anywhere to go with that. And finding a community like a church home is really an important part, because that is some place that we can find that hope, that sense of connection, that sense of purpose. And without it, what we see is really some deaths of desperation, deaths of despair, as what we like to call them in terms today. And we see that all the time. When we just don't have a way to deal with things, we tend to give up. We tend to feel hopeless and helpless. And that's one of the things that we try and do here at Lutheran Church of Hope, is find ways for people to get connected. We like to say around here all the time that we're better together. And that's very, very true. And that's very, very biblical too, in terms of the way that Christ taught us to say, your first job is to love one another. And that is certainly one of the things that, when we think about grief, when we think about going through life and its hardships and the things that are coming at us, we have to remember that our example is to love one another. And the only way we can do that is to be with one another.
And I know you've worked with many, many grieving families over the years. I've seen some of your presentations on grief, and I've always been impressed with your ability to talk about an issue that's so treacherous, let's say. But how do you see the effect of the grieving process on children? A lot of us, decisions at funerals. Well, we're not going to take these children; they're too young, or but it's really disproportionately on the older ones. In other words, I think, is it my fear of aging and dying that makes me grieve even more? And I don't think about what my younger children are thinking, because they're probably not thinking about death yet.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing that, when we're confronted with the reality of death, it does make us think about our own mortality. And when we see children who have lost a parent at a younger age, especially if they are very close to that parent, it does affect how they feel. It does affect the way that they're going to continue. But what usually helps kids at that stage in their development is to know that there are other people that will be there. It's the kids that don't feel like there's anyone else there, or that they are somehow cut off from community of the family, that the family is now somehow disintegrated. That is where they really seem to struggle. So if we can find a way to help our kids get through those things, there's a lot of resources here in the community, here in the Des Moines area. Hamilton Funeral Home has a grief academy, and there are a number of great resources that they have within the community for kids, for adults, people who have lost a spouse, people that have lost a child, all different kinds of griefs, because not every grief and not every loss is the same. And so that's why we are really blessed in this community to have such a number of different places to go. One of the most important things that we do here at Lutheran Church of Hope is our Grief Share program. It's a semester-long program that's 13 weeks long, and it's led by people who've experienced the loss of someone that they love dearly in the past and have kind of worked through that. So they've been down that road, they've kind of experienced those things. In fact, we're having a Surviving the Holidays Grief Share class coming up on November 12th, and it's right here at Lutheran Church of Hope. It's going to be 10 o'clock in the morning to noon. And I'd just like to make that open invitation that if you're struggling with a loss and you're going to have somebody that's not at your table for the holidays this year, we'd love to have you.
Boy, those are great points, because I know for a lot of people, the holidays do create a sense of struggle with loss. We're going to take a short break. We come back. We're going to ask Dan to share some final comments, insights, and inspirations that may help get you through the holidays. See you all after the break.
Today, more than ever, you need fast, reliable internet. At MediaCom, we want you to know you can count on us. Our fiber-powered 100% gigabit technology network was built for the future. We have enormous capacity and power and 99.99% network reliability. So even though these are uncertain times, we're prepared, and you can be certain we'll keep your world connected.
The black truck? Hey, Christina from accounting.
Yeah, hi.
Hey, I used to date a girl named Christina.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then she dumped me for my best friend. You want to see some photos of them that I took?
I don't.
I thought we talked about this, buddy.
Buzz and overshared again?
Yeah,
Yeah. I'm gonna call a car.
that's a smart idea.
So yeah, I know, that's why I did it.
Hey, you're gonna get back to the top of the mountain.
Does that mean I'm gonna get back with Christina?
No.
Oh.
No.
Every second, 127 new devices connect to the internet. You can feel it happening, our digital world expanding with every breath. We're entering a whole new era of connectivity, and MediaCom will be ready to power it with one of the nation's first 10G platforms. We'll be bringing you more speed, more capacity, more security, and the power to do more than you ever dreamed possible.
Welcome back. Today on Surviving Bad, we're talking about grief. In a world seemingly filled with disasters and events that shape our ability to understand our feelings and how to cope, sometimes we need help. Let's see what insights, advice, and inspiration Dan has to share. Welcome back, Dan.
Thanks, Peter. I think one of the most important things that we have to remember is that we have to take really good care of ourselves if we're going through a process of grief. There are a lot of symptoms that overlap with depression, but depression isn't grief and grief isn't depression. But one of the first things that we can do when we experience the death of a loved one is to go get checked out by a doctor. Just go get checked out, because we may be not recognizing some pretty serious physical symptoms. And unfortunately, we see a lot of people that suffer some of the consequences of not paying attention. So that's the number one thing I would advise people to do. If you've lost somebody very close to you, go see your doctor. Let them know that you've experienced that loss. Let them know that this is going on, because that is one of the things that we see being a very big help to a lot of folks. The other thing too is to really give yourself that space, give yourself that time to talk and to actually walk through those things. Find some ways that really speak to you as a way to honor the person who's that you've lost, and maybe figure out ways in which to begin the process of integrating into life again. It doesn't have to be quick, and it doesn't have to be all of a sudden. It can be very, very small steps. It may be just making a phone call and letting somebody know how you're doing. It may be just going to church for the very first time without that loved one. It can be a big deal. It can be kind of overwhelming. It could be picking up the phone and calling a pastor or chaplain like myself, just to talk, just to kind of figure out where am I at? How are things going? The other thing too is that if you're the person who's caring for somebody that's grieving, don't do the typical give them the platitudes of, this is God's way. He called him home, and that's not it's not theologically sound, because God doesn't kill people. He places them where he wants them. That's true, but he also provides a place for us when death takes us. And death is the one that takes us away from our loved one, not God. God creates a way for us to be reunited with our loved ones. And that's really the message of hope. And that's really the message of what Christianity teaches, is that this life is a spot. It is a temporary experience, and that we have an eternity to look forward to. But we need to get in touch with that. We need to make those connections. We need to develop that sense of there's something bigger than ourselves. So those are
you've been a dedicated professional and presided over countless amounts of sessions of grieving and funerals. What sparked your passion early in your life that led you on that journey? Or maybe you didn't, maybe you just sort of wandered into it, but when did that light go off that said, I can do this? Because that's not an easy job.
Yeah, I don't know if I was ever really prepared for it. I remember my grandmother's death when I was in 4th grade. And then most recently I helped care for my dad, who passed away in 2010. And so those experiences kind of got me ready for, I think, talking to people and going through that process myself really kind of opened up the doors that, there's really more to this than what I had anticipated. But figuring out a way to communicate that to other people, helping them understand that they really are in a process of reconciling that new reality in their life with their faith, with their spirituality, I think is really, it's been a lifelong pursuit. It's been a lifelong process. I don't know if I was ever setting out to do this kind of work. Let's put it that way.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that part of your life and that good advice. We appreciate everything you do and wish you all the best. And thank you all for watching us today. Check out our website, ahealthyiowa.org, and keep your eye on MediaCom MC22 for our next episode of Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. On MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.